Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive into the world of 340B.
Mm,
It feels like every week something new pops up in 340B.
it really does.
Today, we are going to be focusing on the latest developments impacting covered entities. Specifically, we are going to look at state legislative efforts to protect those contract pharmacy arrangements, the ongoing battle over manufacturer rebate models in the courts, and then we'll even touch on some broader budget considerations that are happening in Congress. We've got some really great articles and a transcript from a recent 340B Report podcast.
Lots to dive into.
Our mission today is to extract the crucial insights from all of these sources and then help you understand what these developments mean for the 340B landscape as a whole.
Yeah, sounds good. We've got sources from, as you mentioned, 340B report, including articles on California's AB 1460, that dismissal of the antitrust lawsuit against CVS, some reflections from the 340B Coalition Winter Conference, and updates on Pfizer and Teva's contract pharmacy restrictions. And then, yeah, that transcript from that recent episode of the 340B report podcast covering even more on state legislation, rebate litigation, and those congressional budget talks.
Okay, well, let's just jump right into it. Let's start with the state legislative landscape, specifically those efforts to protect contract pharmacies. Now, California's AB 1460 has been introduced to prohibit discriminatory practices by manufacturers. How does this compare to similar efforts in other states?
Yeah, well, California's AB 1460, at least as it's currently drafted, it's pretty concise. It's only a single paragraph, only 4 lines, and basically it aims to prevent drug manufacturers from doing anything that would interfere with a covered entity's ability to buy or dispense 340B drugs through their contract pharmacies. So compared to some other states, it's pretty focused.
Okay, and then one thing that stood out to me was this bill does not currently restrict manufacturer rebate models. Given all the controversy around those, is that a significant omission or is it a deliberate choice?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I think it probably is a deliberate choice, at least for now. The focus of this bill really seems to be on preserving the actual dispensing of medications through those contract pharmacies. Many of the state laws we've seen have been enacted because manufacturers started limiting contract pharmacy access a few years ago. Federal courts have sided with manufacturers and, their right to impose those restrictions. So I think focusing on just that specific piece at the state level makes sense. Now, those rebate models are, as you mentioned, a more recent tactic where manufacturers are asking covered entities to buy drugs outside the 340B program and then seek a rebate later. I think by not tackling rebates, it might make AD 1460 a little bit more resilient to any legal challenges that would surely come from the manufacturers.
Yeah, and those legal challenges are almost guaranteed, right? I mean, the article mentions that all 8 states with enacted laws have faced legal challenges, though, most have been upheld so far. And the Supreme Court even denied certiorari in that Arkansas case, which that feels like a win for the states.
Definitely a win. If history is any indication, if California's AB 1460 becomes law, there will be lawsuits. But the fact that most of the state laws have been upheld and, the appellate court ruling in Arkansas, the Supreme Court declined to hear the case, those offer a little bit of optimism that states do have some authority in this area. It will be interesting to see, though, if the Supreme Court eventually decides to hear one of these cases, and actually establish a nationwide precedent.
Right. Now, the 340B Report podcast transcript actually gave us some really great information on what's happening with these bills at the state level. Sounds like there's been a lot of movement recently. Utah and South Dakota, those really stand out.
Yes, definitely. Utah and South Dakota both saw their contract pharmacy access bills actually pass both chambers of their legislatures, and now those are headed to the governor's desks for signature. And even bigger news, as of Monday, March 10th, South Dakota's governor already signed their bill into law. That makes them the 9th state with such a law in place, and notably the first one in 2025.
That's great. That's great to hear. And I think the transcript also mentioned that Hawaii, Michigan, Kentucky, North Dakota all have bills that have passed at least one chamber. So it sounds like there is a lot of activity.
There really is, which just goes to show how important contract pharmacies are for covered entities and their patients across the country. We're seeing this progress in states with very diverse political landscapes.
Right. And I know that there was also some information on a slightly different topic. 340B provider reporting bills that have popped up in states like Indiana, Michigan, and Idaho. These are a little bit different.
Yeah, a little bit different. So these reporting bills aim to increase transparency by having covered entities report data on their 340B program savings and how they're using them. The scope of those requirements vary quite a bit. Michigan, for example, they have a pretty limited reporting requirement. It's tied to those contract pharmacy access provisions that we just talked about. But then Indiana and Idaho, they're considering much more extensive requirements that are actually similar to what Minnesota already has in place.
Interesting. So some different approaches being taken. Now, the podcast transcript also touched on something a bit more concerning. There's this group, Building America's Future, that's actively working to oppose these contract pharmacy bills.
Yeah.
And their tactics, from what I'm hearing, sound really aggressive.
Yeah, they're definitely aggressive, and Building America's Future is actually a dark money group, which basically means it's not transparent who's actually funding them. They've put up billboards tying unrelated social issues to the 340B program. Then there's a video ad they released, which actually labels Republican lawmakers who support these contract pharmacy bills as, quote, Trump underminers, end quote. The podcast mentioned that lawmakers in Oklahoma were really shocked and rejected those claims, so it actually seems like these aggressive tactics might be backfiring.
Wow. Okay, well, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the manufacturer rebate models. This feels like a really fundamental shift to how 340B works. Can you just give us a high-level overview of what's happening here?
Yeah, so the basic issue here is that drug manufacturers want to change how they provide the 340B discount. So right now it's typically an upfront discount, at the point of sale, but these manufacturers, they want to shift to a rebate model, meaning covered entities would have to buy the drugs at full price and then go through this process of applying for a rebate to get that 340B price. HRSA, so that's the Health Resources and Services Administration, the agency that oversees 340B, they've been really clear that the 340B statute doesn't actually allow these rebate models, at least not without their approval, which they haven't given.
And that difference in opinion has led to litigation. So several companies have filed lawsuits against the federal government, right?
Exactly. There are now 5 drug companies that have actually filed lawsuits against the federal government, challenging HRSA's interpretation of the 340B statute. These lawsuits are seeking to allow these companies to implement their rebate models. And, these lawsuits, they really represent a huge legal battle with potential consequences for the entire 340B program.
Now, the articles highlighted that a federal judge actually approved 340B Health's motion to intervene in 4 of these lawsuits. What exactly does that mean, and why is it so significant?
This is a huge development because it means that 340B hospitals are formally brought into these lawsuits. Before, it was just the drug companies arguing against the government. Now, 340B Health, which represents a lot of 340B hospitals, they'll be able to argue alongside HRSA in court. They can file their own motions and even appeal judicial rulings. This is really important because now covered entities will be directly represented in this litigation.
Right, and we also saw that the American Hospital Association, as well as some other provider groups, have filed amicus briefs in support of the government's position. It sounds like there's a pretty united front forming against these rebates.
Definitely, definitely. These amicus briefs that have been filed by the American Hospital Association and those other provider groups, they really strengthen the government's case. These briefs highlight how harmful these rebate models would be, especially for safety net hospitals, and particularly for those located in rural or underserved communities. Basically, they argue that it would make it really difficult for them to continue providing care to these vulnerable patients. So they're saying that these rebate schemes really are an attempt by drug manufacturers to change how 340B has always worked.
Of course, not everyone is necessarily aligned on this. The articles mentioned that several patient advocacy groups, some of which, interestingly enough, receive funding from the pharmaceutical industry, have filed briefs supporting the rebate models. What's going on there?
That's right. So groups like CF United, the ADAP Advocacy Association, they filed these briefs arguing that the rebate models are actually a good idea. Now, the podcast pointed out that the ADT Advocacy Association has actually received some funding in the past from PHRMA, that's the pharmaceutical industry's main lobbying group. So this obviously raises questions about their motivations for supporting a system that most 340B providers oppose.
Yeah, it's always good to be aware of those funding connections when we're looking at who's supporting what. Now, the podcast also briefly touched on a unique situation with AIDS drug assistance programs, or ADPs, and an existing exception to the upfront discount requirement. Could you explain that?
Yeah, so some ADPs have had some historical challenges accessing the traditional upfront 340B discounts, and so they've actually been allowed to use a rebate mechanism, but that was approved, by the HHS secretary. The key difference here is that this is a very specific exception that was made for very specific circumstances. It's not a precedent for allowing all manufacturers to implement rebates across the board.
Gotcha, that makes sense. Well, this rebate litigation is certainly a huge story that we're going to keep following very closely, but let's move on to another legal development that caught my eye. The dismissal of that antitrust lawsuit against CVS. Can you remind us what that case was all about?
Yeah, so this case was filed by Brandywine Hospital, which is actually closed now, against CVS. And the hospital alleged that CVS was engaging in anti-competitive practices by requiring covered entities to use CVS's own third-party administrator, partner, for their 340B contract pharmacy arrangements.
Okay, and what was the judge's reasoning for dismissing the lawsuit?
The judge said that Brandywine failed to actually prove that the CVS contract pharmacy market is a real thing. Basically, since other pharmacies can dispense the same drugs at comparable prices, the judge didn't see CVS's contract pharmacy program as its own separate market. So the judge dismissed that lawsuit. However, that doesn't mean CVS is off the hook entirely.
Right, the article did mention some other legal and regulatory actions that CVS is facing related to their 340B program.
Definitely, yeah. There is a lawsuit filed by the New York State Attorney General that's being appealed. There was also settlements with Sentry Data Systems and RX Strategies over similar concerns. And then you've got Senator Cassidy and other members of Congress who have sent letters to CVS and these other pharmacy chains asking about their 340B practices.
All right, well, let's pivot to the 340B Coalition Winter Conference, which gave us a little bit of a snapshot into the current sentiment in the 340B community. What were some of the key takeaways or discussions that happened at that conference?
Yeah, it sounds like the biggest takeaway from the conference was just the uncertainty, especially around the potential for those manufacturer rebate models. There was a lot of concern about the financial strain on covered entities as a result of those manufacturer-imposed restrictions, and some were even worried that Sustain 340B Act, which, is that piece of federal legislation that's aimed at strengthening the program, they were worried that might lose momentum. There were some bright spots, though, like the progress being made at the state level with legislation on contract pharmacy access. And of course, there was just a sense of resilience and optimism among attendees.
So a mixed bag of anxieties and hopes.
Yeah, see so.
The progress on those state bills does seem to be encouraging. What else?
Well, the conference, it also really highlighted that there's this strong bipartisan opposition to these rebate models in Congress. Almost 200 House members signed a letter urging HRSA to reject those rebate proposals. And then just the sheer number of people who attended the conference, it shows the dedication and, the desire to really advocate for the program's future.
Okay, well, let's finish up by touching on those congressional budget talks. Now, these always carry the potential for some pretty big impacts on healthcare programs. What are some of the things 340B stakeholders should be paying attention to here?
Yeah, so first and foremost, Congress needs to pass legislation to avoid a government shutdown. That's the immediate concern. But bigger picture, there's talk about some pretty significant cuts to federal health care programs, and Medicaid is one that could be hit pretty hard, which could have downstream consequences for 340B providers, many of whom serve large Medicaid populations.
Yeah, and there was that point raised in the podcast that the chairs of some of the key Senate and House committees with oversight of 340B have actually expressed some concerns about the program in the past, which could mean more scrutiny.
Yeah, that's right. We've seen some legislative proposals that could really harm hospitals in the 340B program, and so it's crucial for everyone to stay informed and really advocate for the program.
Okay, well, as we wrap up this deep dive, it's clear that the 340B landscape is constantly evolving. And I mean, there's so much happening. We're seeing wins at the state level. There are these crucial legal battles playing out over rebates. Then there's the uncertainty in the federal budget. But what stands out to me is the continued pushback against those manufacturer restrictions, those rebate models, and, the strong advocacy efforts by provider groups. That's really encouraging to see.
It is. The progress in states like South Dakota that really highlights the importance of these local wins, and 340B Health intervening in those lawsuits shows a really powerful challenge to the manufacturers. And, even though that antitrust lawsuit against CVS was dismissed, it doesn't mean that the scrutiny of these contract pharmacy arrangements is going to stop.
Exactly, exactly. So as we conclude, the 340B program remains a vital lifeline for so many patients. Understanding these developments is really key to ensuring that the program remains strong. We hope this overview has provided some clarity, some valuable insights into these complex issues. As you consider all this, what are the biggest questions this has raised for you? What would you like to learn more about? What do you want to see us cover in the future? This conversation is really just beginning.